It was a few weeks ago that the hay bale started creeping slowly away from the house. Every morning when I woke up, each had moved a few hundred feet from where it was before. I assumed it was pranksters with nothing better to do, so I ignored it. Within a few days, though, the bales began to approach the boundaries of the farm. I was tired of the whole game by then and decided to move them back. It took a tedious hour to bring them all the way from where they were over to the house again. And by the time I was done, I was ready to snap the neck of whatever little pissant was deciding to screw with me. The next morning, I found each and every one of my horses messily decapitated. The smell was what woke me up. Each one was slumped over against the side of its stall. There were no signs of the heads. I spent the rest of the day cleaning up the mess and burying the remains. It was only when I was done that I noticed the bales had all returned to their positions from the day before, scattered far out into the fields. This time, I left them where they were. That night, I sat on the porch with my shotgun in hand and a pot of coffee on the table beside me. I sat for hours, straining my eyes into the field to catch a glimpse of who was moving my hay bales. Finally, I was beginning to nod off. I would have, but just as my eyes began to close, I heard a clamor and a rustling of trees from the nearby woods. I leaned forward, my heart racing with excitement. I was going to catch the bastard. I fumbled with my gun and fidgeted in my seat, waiting anxiously for whoever it was to get close enough to ambush. It was only when the thing got close enough for me to make out its silhouette in the dark that I was frozen still. The thing that crept into my field from the nearby woods didn't seem to notice me sitting there. It stalked, hunched and deliberate, through the field with the posture of a tiptoeing thief. If not for the fact that it must have towered at least 10 feet tall, even in its crouched position, it might have seemed almost frail. The thinness of its arms and legs were emaciated, caved-in quality of its chest remained. The caved-in quality of its chest reminded me of a starving animal. Still, this thing was undeniably strong, and I watched it hoist up a bale into its arms with ease and set it down carefully, a little bit away. Taking only a few strides to cover the distance, I watched it work, moving each bale thoughtfully. Every once in a while, it would straighten up to look around at the other bales. Before adjusting the one it was working on ever so slightly, before it left, it looked towards the house. I felt its eyes sweep over me in the dark, but whether it saw me or not, I couldn't tell. Then it turned silently and crept back the way it came, disappearing into the dark of the woods. It took me an hour before I had the courage to move at all. I went inside after a while, but didn't sleep that night. It was only when the sun rose that I dared to step off my porch into the fields. The hay bales were where it left them. Strangely, it didn't move them as far as it had in the previous days. They were approaching something invisible in the fields, and as I looked at them, I realized they seemed to be marking some kind of line. Indeed, as I walked around the house, I saw the distinct circle that formed with me at the center. At first, I thought the bales were just being haphazardly moved away from the house, but now I could see that they were instead being moved towards some boundary. The thing was sending me a message. I slept uneasy that night, and only because I was exhausted. The next morning the bales hadn't moved at all. They didn't move for at least the rest of that week. In fact, they were finally where the thing wanted them. I made myself sick, trying to interpret them. Why would this thing expend so much energy moving my hay bales and threaten me with such violence? Should I even try to interfere? Killing my horses was just a threat, an intelligent threat at that. It knew it would scare me, and it knew that I understand the implications. The sound of the automobile working its way along the road to my farm one morning gave me a little rush of excitement. I've been planning to embed in the farm since I saw the thing, but I couldn't hope to leave on foot without it risking treating me like it treated the horses. But if I could get in that car, with whoever was coming my way, I might be able to escape before it could stop me. I didn't know or care who it was. I decided that the moment the car stopped, I would jump in the passenger seat and tell them to get the hell out of here. I didn't get the chance. The car worked its way slowly along the road, trundling across the uneven ground. I urged it decidedly to hurry. It was when it passed between the two bales, placed on the other side of the road, I began to hear a booming clattering from the woods. The thing burst suddenly from between the trees, sprinting on all fours of its terrible, gangly limbs towards the car. Within a few seconds it was there, pouncing on the automobile like a predatory cat. Within moments, it was picking and peeling the vehicle's steel frame apart, working to get at the driver. The man, whoever it was, screamed. All the while I could hear him over the crunching of the metal and shattering of glass. It was only when the thing crushed him carelessly in his hand that the screaming stopped. It tossed him away and straightened up to look at me once again. In the sunlight, I could see the inhumanity of it. It was composed entirely of something awful and alive, which was lashed together in a messy semblance of human form. Whatever it was made of looked so polished and hard that if it weren't for the minute withering of the stuff, I'd think it was made of granite. The thing retreated back into the woods, and I was left to my shock. My eyes wandered back to the car. The engine was still sputtering. Between the two hay bales, suddenly I understood. The message was clear. I am this thing's captive, and I am not allowed visitors. Nothing may cross the borders it has set. I'm trapped here by the thing that stalks the fields, and it demands nothing except that I never leave. Still, I don't know if I can handle being this thing's canary. I've been thinking hard for the last few days, since I saw it crush that man's chest and silence him before he could finish his scream. If I crossed the hay border, it'd probably do the same. It'd smash my skull before I could put my hands up to protect myself. It'd go and find a new pet, and probably keep looking until it found someone who could stand knowing that it was waiting just outside, watching it all hours with its shiny insect eyes. I've been thinking hard over the last few days. I might just make a run for it. Back in the early 70s, I found myself sleeping on beaches, flop houses, and the like. I stayed in some very weird places, including a cave. Fact is, I lived in that cave for a while. It was pretty nice as far as caves go. It wasn't huge, but big enough. The main area, what I thought of as my living quarters, was about the size of a studio apartment. At the back, it branched off into a couple of tunnels. It didn't smell all funky of bat shit or animal either, so I thought I was pretty safe. Gave me a place to sleep and get out of the rain at any rate, until something better came along. During the day, I'd walk down to the wharf and play my flute for the tourists and make a little coin. I'd usually take it and get some food or other necessity. On the way back to the cave, I'd gather firewood. As it got dark, I'd build myself a nice little campfire by the mouth of the cave. I'd sit by it and have my dinner, maybe read a bit or watch the flames until I felt tired enough to sleep. Overall, not a bad life. One day I woke up to a really bad downpour. I couldn't see much past the mouth, it was just raining so hard. It made me happy to be in a nice dry cave, instead of huddling under a plastic trash bag. I stoked up the fire and was feeling pretty good. I'd made a habit of bringing in a few more sticks of wood than I thought I'd use, so I could keep the fire going for quite a while. I still had most of a jar of peanut butter and some crackers, and the paperback I hadn't read yet. Seems to me I was pretty well set for the day. I was sitting there, reading, when some movement caught the corner of my eye. I turned towards the cave's opening, not knowing what to expect. Between a flickering firelight and the rain, I could barely make out the form of a man standing at the entrance. I stood up, calling out,
"Hello?"
The guy didn't say a word, just reached out his hand, palm up, then raised his other arm as if to show me he was unarmed. Pretty strange, but okay. I tell him to come in before he drowns. His steps are hesitant, almost like he's scared of me, and he stooped over. I smile and invite him to sit by the fire and ask him if he's hungry. Peanut butter on crackers isn't fancy, but when you're hungry, it's enough for a feast. He smiled back and shook his head no. Two things struck me at once. He was older than dirt, filthy, and he was bone dry. bone dry when he had just come out of the pouring rain. That's not right. Rain is water. Water makes things wet. And this guy is dry. I start asking questions like what he's doing out in this weather. If he got lost or something. Again, with the head shake no. Then I wondered if maybe he's mute or something. I didn't ask out loud, and he says, "No, Sonny, I can talk, just wondering about you. But I guess you mean no harm. You ain't no claim jumper, are you?" I laughed. Nope, no claim jumper here. Didn't know this was a mine either. Is and isn't was natural when I found it. You've seen the tunnels, right? I dug those, mostly by hand. I just invited a lunatic to share my fire was my first thought, followed by just an old man having me on, followed by how'd he know about these tunnels then? Maybe he's been here before. Nope, not crazy, and yep, here long before you were. Told you, it's my claim. I stared in disbelief. I've not spoken a word of what I was thinking out loud. Just then, there was the loudest clap of thunder and my head turned instinctively towards the mouth of the lightning that lit up the outside. I must have jumped a foot when that thunder sounded. Laughing at myself, I turned back to where the old man sat, but he was gone. As old as he was, he couldn't have moved fast enough for me not to see him if he was headed towards the back, and he sure didn't pass me going out. So this story of mine is quite normal compared to the experiences of my coworkers in the Ortegas. But being so ignorant to the happenings on the place and experiencing it firsthand sums up a frightening story. It was a normal Monday afternoon in our office, about 2:30 p.m., and our office was busy with meetings, reports, and other paperwork. There I was sitting at my cubicle, finishing some paperwork and rushed reports, when suddenly I heard a low psst at my back. I quickly turned to where the psst came from, but all the people in my station at the time, there were 2 in my station, were busy finishing their work. I decided that maybe it was one of my coworkers playing a trick on me, so I quickly paid no attention to it and got back to my work. About 20 minutes had passed and another psst came from behind me. That time I didn't bother to turn around because in my mind it was just one of my friends playing a trick on me, so I can hear the continuous psst from behind me. I was getting irritated, and that's why I took my laptop and moved to the next table that is just beside me. I quickly plugged my laptop to the internet and continued on my work. But after 30 minutes of finishing my report, I heard another psst, and this time it didn't come from my back, but instead from under the table where I was working. I pushed my chair so that I could see under my table, but there was no one there. I stood up and asked my coworkers if they were the ones creating the psst noise, and if they had heard it. They said that they weren't and that they didn't hear anything. I was really scared at the time, and I felt goosebumps all over my body. I returned to my own table, submitted my report, and went home early that afternoon. Turns out, I'm not the only one who's experienced that. Some of my coworkers shared their story, and they were more frightening than mine. Some of them would even run out of their cubicle, but some of them were already used to it by then and didn't mind anymore. Thanks for taking the time to read my story. Jacob cursed as he pushed through the thick underbrush, trying to make his way to the tree. He was certain that this location would give him an optimal line of sight of the neighboring field in which he frequently saw large herds of deer. This was going to be his year, and he was sure of it. This is the year that I bring home my trophy buck, he thought. As he recalled the events of the day so far, he had awakened at 4:30 a.m. and had began to prepare for a long day in the woods, on the back side of his farm. His first order of business had been to locate and rescue his gloves and camouflaged hunting gear from whatever undisclosed area of his home that his wife had hidden them. He would most assuredly need them this morning to protect him from the bitter cold November morning. How could it be this cold, this early in the year? He wondered as he started to work on his second task of the day, which was to prepare a breakfast that would stick to his ribs along during the day. He wasn't entirely sure what he wanted this morning, but he finally settled on toast, country ham, and scrambled eggs that were just a little too runny. He topped it all off with a large cup of coffee that had left a bitter taste on his tongue. In fact, he could still taste it. After accomplishing task 1 and 2, he packed himself a bologna and cheese sandwich for lunch, grabbed his Remington 30-06 hunting rifle and thermos of coffee, and headed out the door. He loaded his gear into his truck and pulled out of the driveway and turned right into the one-lane back top road that led into the backside of his property. After about 2.25 miles, he turned right again off the blacktop onto a dirt road that was gouged deep into the mud-filled ruts. He had traveled about a half a mile down that pitful, rut-filled excuse for a road, and came to a desired location. He got out of his truck and loaded his gun and sauntered off into the woods. Jacob had gone a little more than 500 yards into the densely wooded tree line when he began to wish that he had put an extra layer of clothing to shield him against the chilly morning air. 10 minutes out of the truck and he was already cold, and it was made worse by the cloudy overcast day, and the wind was blowing steadily through the trees, making the autumn leaves rattle like dry bones. Oh well, he thought, it's going to be a good day anyway, especially if I bring home a big one. Jacob took about 10 more steps when an uneasy feeling began to creep over him. He felt as someone stepped over his grave. He got the distinct feeling that he was being watched, but by whom? This was his property, and it was posted. No one had permission to be on his land. He had to be alone, but if he was alone, why couldn't he shake this eerie feeling that was scratching at the base of his skull? Something was off today. There was a deafening silence in the forest. No bird or insects, only the sound of the wind in the trees. Convincing himself that it was nothing more than a case of nerves, he continued to press on until he came to a clearing not far from his tree stand. Stepping into the clearing, Jacob saw the remains of what appeared to be a large deer. He wasn't quite able to make out what he was seeing from this distance because the sun wasn't completely up yet and the forest was still enveloped in shadows. Jacob walked closer to get a better look and found that he had been correct. It was a deer. A large 8-point buck, in fact. Looking at the remains, he felt a sense of dread come over him, and icy fingers danced along his spine. Something about this kill just didn't seem right. The throat was completely torn out, and the stomach was ripped open, plus several of the internal organs were missing. It was the most grisly thing he had ever seen. This definitely wasn't a coyote kill, and no hunter would have done this. They would have taken the head to have it mounted. What could have done this, he wondered. A fear, like nothing he had ever experienced before, began to wash over him in waves. What is going on? He thought. At nearly 225 pounds and well over 6 foot, he wasn't one to give in to fear. But now, he couldn't seem to calm down, and his heart was beating like a trip hammer. The feeling that he was being watched was getting stronger by the minute, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was moments away from a bad situation. He slowly started to back away from the mangled carcass and headed back to his truck. No more than 6 steps into his journey, his blood turned to ice in his veins as a deep, guttural, wailing scream shattered the eerie silence and what was left of his courage. He had grown up on a farm all his life and had been an experienced hunter since his childhood. He was familiar with every animal in this part of the state. Not even a cougar, a bobcat, or a bear could have produced that scream that had torn through the early morning forest and filled him with such a bone-chilling apprehension. Primal fear now gave way to stark terror as he chambered around into his 30-06 and turned around only to find that there was nothing behind him. His mind raced with confusion, and he was confronted with a million thoughts at once. What should I do? What could it be? Should I run? Am I gonna die? His survival sense was kicking into overdrive. Jacob decided to continue on his previously contrived plan, which was to go to the truck and get out of there while the getting was good. Slowly and cautiously, he made his way toward the perceived salvation of his vehicle, silently praying every step of the way. With 300 yards separating him from his avenue of escape, Jacob began to hear heavy foots fall off to his left. He could hear the crunching of withered leaves, sticks and debris that littered the forest floor. Summoning every ounce of courage that remained within him, he forced himself to look in that direction. And that is when he saw the dark silhouette that followed him through the densely tangled forest. Quickening his pace, he redoubled his efforts to reach the truck and to get a phone and call the sheriff, the game warden, or anyone that would listen. He couldn't tell what it was that was stalking him, but he could clearly see that it towered for more than 7 feet and was incredibly massive. Jacob couldn't help but think he wasn't about to become a national statistic, a person who left home under normal circumstances and just disappeared without a trace. How many people, he wondered, go into the woods and just vanish, and the authorities just assume they have become lost or injured or been the victims of animal attacks, with their bodies never recovered? Please God, don't let that happen to me, he thought as he drew closer and closer to his truck. 75 yards became 50, 50 became 30, and 30 became 10. Like a miracle, he was back and opening his door. Throwing his rifle inside, and he pulled himself into the cab. He started the engine and hit the gas, but the truck went nowhere. He had parked in a large mud puddle, and now the tires simply spun, slinging mud 30 feet behind him. Oh no, not now, he thought. I can't be stuck. Not now. Allowing himself a moment to think, Jacob remembered this truck is a 4-wheel drive. There is no way I can be stuck. Reaching down, he locked his truck in 4-wheel drive and was prepared to punch the gas and leave this nightmare behind. Unfortunately for Jacob, some nightmares are not so easily left behind, and there is nothing worse than a nightmare you can't wake up from. And Jacob was about to learn that the hard way. Hearing something to his right, he instinctively turned and immediately wished he had not. It turned and looked at him. It took him maybe half a second to turn his head, but he would have given anything in the world to have that half a second back, because it was the last moment that his world would ever seem normal again. In that split second, his world changed. It was no longer a place where the world was light and safe, where he was just a husband and a father and a guy that liked to hunt and watch football on the weekends. That reality had evaporated away like the morning fog, and all that was left was a world where monsters existed and things really went bump in the night. And now, an ambassador from the nightmare realm was standing just outside his passenger door, a visible reminder that this world had been turned upside down. Jacob screamed as he stared transfixed on this escapee from a horror movie. In his most terrifying, fevered dream, he couldn't have imagined such a thing could exist. It was hideously ugly, easily standing 8 feet tall, with a thick, muscular body. It looked very apish in appearance, but then again, it didn't. There was just something about that face that was just so wrong, almost like an obscene amalgamation of man and animal that had gone horribly awful. It was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. It was completely covered with thick, shaggy black hair that was matted in areas with god-awful smells and God only knows what. It walked on 2 legs, not 4 like you would expect from some kind of animal. That was when this thing had shattered his perception of reality. Was it a demon? Or a werewolf? It can't be, he thought. Those things don't exist. Maybe it was some kind of reject from the island of Dr. Moreau, or whatever it was. It was staring at him, and did not look happy. The menacing juggernaut threw its enormous head back and let out a blood-curdling scream that resonated throughout the surrounding area and seemed to vibrate to his very core. Shocked back into action, Jake threw his truck into gear and took off, as though he were being chased by the very hounds of hell. Jacob, mind racing, wondered what he was going to do. How will I ever feel safe from this farm again? Are my wife and children in danger? Where did this thing come from? And will anyone believe me? The whirlwind of thoughts that swirled through Jacob's mind came to an immediate stop as he slammed on his brakes and nearly slid off the road. In a state of disbelief, Jacob sat staring at the large hackberry tree that laid across the dirt road and blocked his path, preventing him from reaching the blacktop and guaranteed safety. How is this even possible? He thought. I just came down this road not even 30 minutes ago. This path was clear. However, this tree came to be across the road. It was painfully obvious to Jacob that he had to get the tree moved if he was going to make it home. Since he had neither chain to pull the tree off the road, nor did he have a saw with which he could cut up this unexpected barricade, he was left with few viable options, one of which was walking, which he discounted almost immediately. The logical course of action was to call for help. His best friend Kenny Patterson owned a farm just over from his, and if he could get him to bring a saw to cut up the tree for him, Jacob, with his nerves still frazzled and frayed, reached into his glove box and pulled out his cell phone and clumsily dialed Kenny's number. The phone rang 6 times, and Jacob was about to give up when Kenny answered the phone and said, "Hey, Ugly, what do you want this early in the morning?" As quickly as he could, he related the recent events to Kenny and said, "Man, please hurry. I'm not kidding, there is something out here." Kenny, hearing the shakiness in his friend's voice, assured him that he would be there in a matter of minutes. Jacob thanked him and hung up the phone and braced himself for what was sure to be the longest few minutes of his life. Sitting motionlessly, with bated breath, there in the truck, every sound made his imagination run wild with fear and expectance. Even though little more than 3 minutes had passed since he had spoken to Kenny, it felt as if hours had passed. Each tick of the clock seemed to be an eternity. Jacob frequently checked in all directions for any sign for that nightmarish monstrosity that pursued him. In every shadow that the forest in this irritatingly cloudy day produced, he thought he saw the shape of the black beast that had followed him out of the woods, and he was afraid that he would lose his sanity long before Kenny arrived to clear the tree out of his way. After what seemed like a lifetime, Jacob heard the sound of Kenny's old truck sputtering up the road, and in just moments he was able to see the old red Chevrolet as it made its way closer to him. Jacob's spirits lifted when he saw his old friend and a sense of release washed over him as he realized he was no longer alone. Stepping out of his truck, Jacob said, "Man, what took you so long? I asked you to hurry." Kenny, with an indignant look on his face, said, "What are you talking about? You only called me 11 minutes ago. I think I made pretty good time." Jacob could hardly believe only 11 minutes had passed. It had seemed so much longer. After apologizing to his friend and telling him exactly how happy he was to see him, both men walked over to the fallen tree and made a discovery that startled them both. The tree had not been broken. It had not been cut. It had been pushed over and completely uprooted. All around the tree were large, bipedal footprints that had somewhat human appearance to them. But if they were human, the owner would require a size 28 shoe. Jacob and Kenny looked at each other, and then, without a word, went on work on the tree. Kenny took a chainsaw from the bed of his truck and began to cut up the fallen blockade. Meanwhile, Jacob pulled the logs and debris from the road. Mission accomplished. Kenny put away his saw, and he and Jacob were about to get in their vehicles and leave. But before either man had even opened their doors, an ear-splitting scream that would have filled a banshee with paralyzing fear erupted from the woods behind them. Warily, Jacob walked over to Kenny and whispered, "That's what I was telling you about. I don't know what that thing is, man, but it looked like some kind of monster. I think we need to get out of here, now." Kenny, who looked as though the blood had been drained completely out of his face, became very pale as he said to Jacob, "Jacob, man, I've never really mentioned this before, but over the last few months, that thing has been killing off many of my cows. Their throats are usually torn out, the bodies are mangled. I didn't want anyone to accuse me of being crazy and making stuff up, so I never said anything about it. But that's the reason I rushed over when you called. I've never heard a sound a few times off in the distance like that, but never this close. So I think you're right, old buddy. It's time to go." Cautiously, and with a sense of urgency, Jacob and Kenny climbed into their vehicles and expeditiously made their way back to the blacktop. Turning left, both vehicles began the 2.5-mile trek that led back to Jacob's house so that they could decide what course of action should be taken. Jacob could feel the temperature drop as snow began to gently fall. He reached over and turned his wipers on as snow began to pelt the windshield harder. As he passed his neighbor, William Springer's farm, he noticed a herd of deer grazing in the field that bordered his own property. Having put a bit of distance between himself and the nightmare he had just encountered, Jacob felt a renewed sense of security as his fatigued nerves began to calm. Not willing to let this opportunity pass him by, Jacob turned on his hazard lights and pulled over to the shoulder on the road and signaled Kenny to do the same. Kenny instinctively knew what Jacob was thinking and pulled in behind him and turned his ignition off. Getting out of his truck, Kenny said, "What are you doing, man? We need to get out of here now." Jacob said, I know. We will in just a minute, man. I just can't turn this down. I have to take a shot at this 6-point buck standing there. It's not the trophy that I wanted, but at least I won't go home empty-handed. And after the morning we've had, I think we deserve a little something good." "All right, just take the shot so we can go. I don't feel right about this," Kenny said. Steadying his rifle across the hood of his truck, Jacob zeroed in on the buck and prepared to fire. That's when he heard Kenny making a gasp and whisper, "Oh my God." "What is it, man? What's wrong with you?" "Raise your scope 3 inches, he said. Raising the scope, Jacob immediately saw what had been causing Kenny's alarm. Standing just outside the tree line on the edge of the field was the creature they had left behind. Not even 5 minutes before. Was this thing following them? Was it after the deer? What was it doing? Jacob watched the creature through the scope for a full 30 seconds before it ever moved, and when it did, it ignored him and the deer and started to lope off towards William's barn. That was just about 500 yards from where the woodland demon had been standing. Jacob called out to Kenny and said, "Kenny, call William. Tell him there's something trying to get into his barn. I know, he has at least 2 mares with fowls in there. And if that thing gets in, it will definitely kill them." In an attempt to be rid of this monster, werewolf, Sasquatch, Wendigo, or whatever it was, Jacob fired a shot but missed. The creature turned in their direction and glared at them with red, hate-filled eyes, and then began to run towards them at full steam. Kenny, who was still on the phone with William, screamed at Jacob to get in his truck and go. Jacob did as he was told, and Kenny followed suit. Starting their trucks, Jacob and Kenny both raced to Jacob's house, as though they were driving on a NASCAR circuit. They arrived at Jacob's home, gun in hand, and ran inside to get a phone book so they could call the game warden and the police to get some kind of animal control out there to get rid of this thing. Jacob had just stepped out onto his front porch when they heard gunfire coming over from William's place. Dropping the phone book and running back inside, Jacob grabbed his 12-gauge pump shotgun and some shells and handed them over to Kenny, who took a little time loading it. Jacob and Kenny, now locked and loaded, walked over together to Kenny's truck, preparing to mount up and rescue for their neighbor William. Simultaneously, both of them stopped in their tracks as an uneasy but familiar feeling crept over them, and Jacob's Rottweiler and 2 German Shepherds began to whimper and ran under the porch to hide. Kenny, whose throat had suddenly gone dry as bone, whispered and said, "I have a really bad feeling about this." No sooner had the words escaped his lips, they heard a deafening scream erupted from the forest off to their right. The creature exploded from the trees in front of them. Until now, neither man had been able to fully appreciate the colossal size and scope of the beast, but standing less than 30 feet away, they were almost overcome by the sheer magnitude of it. Jacob had seen it up close earlier from his truck while sitting down, and had guessed the height maybe 8 feet. But now, standing there, looking up, he could tell that this fellow was 8.5 or 9 feet tall and would tip the scale at 800 to 1,000 pounds easily. It had inhumanly long arms that bulged with thick, ropey muscle that were easily seen beneath its long, shaggy black hair, which covered it from head to toe. The chest was larger than a 55-gallon drum, and there was little doubt that it could have pulled the arms off an ape, and now it glared at them with malevolent intent. Jacob and Kenny both opened fire without hesitation. The creature screamed with rage as the bullets tore into its massive body, knocking it to the ground, but not killing it or seriously injuring it. Jacob and Kenny watched, speechless, as it crawled into the tree line. It struggled to its feet and limped away. Jacob ran back to the porch and grabbed the phone book and called the local game warden. Nearly 2 hours later, Gene Trebar, the local warden, showed up to take their statements and told them that there could be an answer to numerous such reports in the area, but he wasn't sure what to make of these reports. "Guys," he said, "I don't know what to tell you. There is no animal in this area, or any area for that matter, that fits your description. I'm not saying I don't believe you. I just don't know what it is." Jacob, whose face was reddened from anger, said, "Come on here. Here is the blood from where we shot it, and here are the footprints." A look of complete confusion washed over Gene's face when he asked if they would care to go with him as he tried to track it. Jacob and Kenny agreed, but they said they weren't going without a gun. Gene stated that he planned to take his gun as well. All 3 men loaded their guns and set out, following the deeply impressed tracks and droplets of blood that had fallen with the withered leaves. They followed the trail for about a mile until arriving at a creek that was located deep in Jacob's woods, where the tracks that they were following were joined by others just like them. Some were smaller, but at least one set was larger. Deciding that the safest course of action would be to return home, they all went back to Jacob's. None of them relished the idea of staying out in the woods longer, since they were now apparently more than one of this creature, and the cloudy overcast day made the forest seem even darker than it normally would be at this time of day. Back at Jacob's, Jean informed them that there was nothing left that they could do but file it under an unknown animal sighting, which made both Kenny and Jacob anything but happy. Jacob and Kenny spent the next couple of days trying to warn their neighbors to use caution when they were out in the forest. Most of their friends just laughed at them when they said they'd probably seen a bear or something. No one believed them except William, who had seen it himself the day before. He'd even taken a shot at it, but missed. Jacob, William, and Kenny knew what they had seen, and knew it was still out there. They didn't care who believed them, and who didn't. Over the next few weeks, more and more neighbors began to take the story a little more seriously, as a family's pets began to disappear, and others were found brutally mangled. Other farms in the area began to find their cows and other livestock torn up with their throats ripped out. Just a week after shooting the creature in his yard, Jacob's own Rottweiler was found dead with its throat torn out, hanging across a limb in a tree in his front yard. It almost seemed like it was a revenge killing. A few days later, one of William's new fowls died in the same way. The fowl's mother had to be put to sleep because she had gone into shock over whatever she had witnessed there in the barn when her fowl was killed. Some people in the area still don't believe. They think the whole story was made up, but Jacob and Kenny know that there is something out there in the forest. They occasionally find tracks or a slaughtered cow or goat. They still hear the blood-curdling screams off in the woods at night. They know that there is still something out there watching and waiting, hiding and biding its time. Something cold and cunning and cruel. Something not human with a taste for blood and revenge. The Dark Woods Demon. Vapor climbs into the air in elegant, wispy streams. It rises delicately into the air before disappearing. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. Light snow is falling. I live alone. The neighborhood is dark and still. The ideal time to grab a glass of wine, strip down, and hop into the hot tub nestled privately in my backyard. Wintertime always dries out my sinuses, and the steam from the 99-degree water is refreshing. I lean back, close my eyes, and listen to the comforting water churn and bubble around me. Nothing is wrong in the world right now. I sit content, relishing this perfect moment in time. That's when I hear it. A faint stirring and the falling of debris coming from the rooftop of the house. I think to myself, son of a bitch, there's someone on my roof. I reach for my towel to cover myself. When I see it, a long, shaky hand emerges from the rooftop. It explores around, touching each of the roof shingles as it is trying to find just the right spot to grip. The other hand appears and does the same. Then a third and a fourth hand emerge. As it pulls itself up further over the edge of the roof, its thin and long body comes into full view. It resembles a short-toned male, except for the 2 extra arms. Its skin is jet black and rough, as if its body was charred and burned. I immediately lower myself into the steamy water as far as I can. The water level is reaching just below my nose. I press myself against the side of the tub, hoping that the darkness and billowing steam will hide my presence from this terrifying creature scuttling up my rooftop just 10 feet away. In spite of its trembling, it moves from the rooftop to the edge of the house with the purposeful movement of a tarantula, lifting one hand high into the air before bringing it down, feeling around the surface before moving the other limb. Then it does the impossible. It lowers itself over the edge and begins crawling on the wall. The comparison of this man-spider is now complete. I gasp from surprise. Taking in a little water through my nose, I snort and contain my coughs as well as I can. I slide deeper into this water, the eyes just above the waterline now, like I was pretending to be a silly alligator. It jerks its head piercingly upwards and sniffs the air. My eyes widen. It flicks its head to the left. Tears swell in my eyes from the fear. It twists its head sharply to the right and inhales the air. I sink even lower and go prone to the hot tub's wall. My heart thumping in my chest. Water splashing in my face. It resumes, snaking alongside my house like a nightmarish arachnid. It goes from window to window, checking to see if any will open. It meticulously pulls on each window frame and presses a clubbed hand against every window pane. Flashes of panic fill my heart at the thought of that horrid thing gaining entry to my home. I try to think of anything within my immediate reach that I could use as a weapon. Luck seems to be on my side. Every window was locked and shut tight. It drops its shoulder in disappointment and slowly makes its way to the edge of the house. It leaps high into the air and lands on a nearby tree. It disappears into the night as if it had never been there. I slowly slip out of the warm comfort of the hot tub's water and reach out for my towel. One foot over the edge and then the other. The water drifts from my body as I exit the tub. Crash. I am paralyzed with gut-wrenching fear from the shattered wine glass I put on the edge of the towel. To hell with the modesty. I run buck naked for the door. 10 feet. I see the shape of a man rustle in the trees. 6 eyes reflect in the moonlight, and it shrieks a god-awful scream. 8 feet, with loud snapping and breaking of tree limbs, it leaps high into the air and lands on the roof's edge. 4 feet, I slip into the icy porch, skinning my elbows and knees. 2 feet, it drops to the ground and scurries on the snow. Yellow drool pours out of its mouth, prominently standing out in the contrast to its obsidian flesh. 1 foot, I lay against the doorknob slipping in my wet and trembling fingers. Hissing and gurgling are growing louder and stronger. 0. I pull myself inside and past the door's frame. I slam the door and lock it. Not a second later, a crash of something slamming into the wooden door booms across the dark house. I lay with my back against the door in case it tries to force its way through it. But no more sounds come from the other side of the door. I turn and slowly lift my head to peer out through the window. Our eyes meet, only a thin pane of glass separating us. It glares at me intently with the sick, unblinking eyes. Then, in a flash, it's gone. That was 2 months ago. It still comes most nights. Not every night, but most nights. No one believes me. Every day before sunset, I check every window and every door to make sure they are locked. I dread the day that I forget to lock that one single window. It will eventually get inside. It's getting smarter. It won't be long before it realizes it doesn't have to move on just because this flimsy window is locked. I remember this day like it was yesterday. The events that took place were just too terrifying to forget. My name is John Wayner. I love nature and going hiking. The sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling with wilderness active in the background relaxes me. I was hiking on a trail not too far from my house one day, October 21st of 1987 to be exact, when I came across an elderly man who was limping with a cane at his side, walking slowly towards my direction. I began to feel dread in my body as I got closer. When I finally got near him, he spoke to me in a raspy voice and asked if I have ever heard of Crow's Lake. I replied no. The man smelt of mildew and dust. He then laughed and said, "I see you like nature," and asked if he could give me a suggestion. Sure," I replied. Now, at this point in time, I knew I should have walked away, but me being the curious 20-year-old I was, I decided to listen. Crow's Lake is just a few miles from here. All you have to do is head north and turn right where you see the largest oak tree. There will be a park right next to it. Once you see it, park your car and walk on the path nearest to your left. The trail will be around 1 mile. You'll eventually see a large, black lake on the left of the trail, which is Crow's Lake. You will be amazed at what you will see because of how beautiful the surrounding area is. Oh, and John, those have ventured to Crow's Lake say that it is impossible to leave. The man then walked away slowly from me, limping with every step. I then wondered how the hell he knew my name. I never told him. Since I didn't have to go back to work until Monday of the next week, I decided to check the place out. I drove in the direction he had told me to go, following every turn and landmark he told me about. It was about 15 minutes to reach the park. I parked my car and walked on the trail he told me about. With the trail only being 1 mile, I got to Crow's Lake relatively quick. The lake was pitch black, and the surrounding area had an eerie vibe to it. I couldn't see any sign of life besides the trees and various forests of plants. I stared at the lake for what seemed like minutes. Something seemed unnatural about it. Out of nowhere, the sounds of crows calling off echoed behind me. I turned my head slowly, and nothing but the feeling of dread filled my body when I saw that old man standing right behind me, smiling with his crooked yellow teeth, stained with tartar. He walked forward, and I tried to move and run away, but it felt like I was paralyzed. He then pushed me into the lake as I drifted deeper and deeper into the dark abyss. Only one thought went through my head. Just how deep is this lake? I was literally just by the shore, and it felt like I had drifted 50 feet already. Bubbles had begun to float down the bottom. I was confused because I was drifting down, not up. I just swam in the direction of the bubbles anyway, and eventually reached the surface coughing and panting for air. I pulled myself onto the shore and my drenched clothes. The surrounding area was quiet. It seemed a bit sinister. I looked up at the sky and saw it was blood red. What the hell? How long was I down there for? When I just got here, it was only 2 p.m., so it couldn't have been that long. Plus, the sun was still shining. Come to think of it, I don't even see the sun. I decided to head back home and get some rest from the weird day I was having. When I got to my old car, that old man was there staring and laughing at me. I cussed him out and sped out of the parking lot. The roads were empty and I didn't see anyone at all, but I ignored this and headed home. When I got to my apartment and walked in the front door, no one was in the lobby. Not even the front desk worker, Mr. Williams. I checked the time, and it read 3 p.m. He doesn't leave work until 5, so this puzzled me. I just guessed he got sick and left early. I headed to my room and went to bed. When I woke, it was 3 a.m. Everything was still and quiet. The silence made me unnerved. Around this time, the guy above me usually has loud music playing, but there was no music being played. I decided to get my ass up and see what the problem was. I headed over to my neighbor's door and knocked on it, but didn't get any answer. I knocked again, but still no answer. Surprisingly, the door was unlocked, which allowed me to sneak in and take a peep inside. I yelled his name, but no one answered and no one was there. Nothing but dread filled my body when I realized this. I ran out to my car panicking and sweating with fear. I yelled out into the open, "Hello, is anyone there?" A black figure appeared in the distance. Oh, thank God.
I finally found somebody. Hey man, do you know what the hell is going on? He didn't respond. Instead, he got closer, limping as he walked. When he got closer, I could tell this was no man. The thing's body was black with distorted limbs, a twisted face with no eyes and 3 rows of sharp, jagged teeth. A gurgling noise came from its mouth as if it were trying to breathe. I got in the car and sped off downtown and stopped in front of the town hall. When I got out of my car, it felt as if a sinister presence awaited me. I went inside the town hall, so I could use the phone, because my phone had water damage. The phones in the building unfortunately weren't working either. Damn it! That's just great. No one is around. The whole city is pretty much a ghost town, and some weird thing is chasing me. A faint gurgling noise came from outside. It was one of those black things in front of the glass doors, banging on them, trying to get in. I quickly ducked so it wouldn't see me, but this was a failed attempt, because it banged even harder on the glass when it saw I tried to hide from it. Oh man, what is there to do now? It's just standing out there, staring back at me with its non-existing eyes. I backed away slowly, but made a mistake and hit the desk, causing a phone to drop on the floor, making a loud buzzing noise. This apparently angered the creature, and made it bang on the glass doors even harder, causing it to crack. I decided to run away in the dark and narrow hallways to hide from it. As soon as I entered the halls, there was a loud, crashing noise coming from the front. It had gotten in. I ran into a room that was further into the hall and closed the door behind me quietly. I'm surprised you actually came, John. I turned quickly and saw that the same old man I met earlier that day. Where the hell did you take me, you son of a bitch? Crow's Lake, the land of sorrow. Stay here, John, with my children and I. Fuck you. Tell me how to leave this place before I kick the shit out of you. So, you want to leave, huh? All you have to do is swim down into the lake and you'll eventually reach your world. But I'll only tell you this once. If your skin gets touched just once by one of my children, you'll turn into them and stay here for eternity. The man gave a raspy laugh, turned into a crow, and flew out the window. A banging came from the door I just shut. It was that thing. My heart began to race as these things' arms crashed through the door. I decided to jump through the window that was just broken. The shards of glass that were left behind tore into my skin, causing me to bleed. The adrenaline coursing through my veins allowed me to not feel any pain though. I ran to my car and stopped when I saw a black creature standing around my car. I ran back, behind the building. How the hell am I going to get over there? Come on, think, John, think. Aha. All I have to do is catch its attention and run around the corner. It'll follow me. And then, when it's around the corner, I can just run back to my car and drive away. I shouted, and it chased it after me. When it got closer, we both ran and then turned the corner to the back of the tower hall. My body froze when I saw what was in front of me. There were hundreds of those things just standing, not making a single noise. One of them saw me and gurgled, which caught its companion's attention. I ran and dodged the creature that was chasing me. They all followed behind as well. As soon as I got into my car, I sped off, and soon got away from the city. When I was about 5 miles from the lake, my car had indicated a low fuel sign. Come on, just a few more miles. It gave out on me anyway when I was just 3 miles away. I just got out and left that piece of junk behind. When I finally got to the trail that led to Crow's Lake, the ground had begun to shake as if it was an earthquake. There, in the distance, behind me were those things running towards me at fast speed. I immediately ran on the path all through the forest. They were fast as hell and eventually caught up to me. I was halfway through, adrenaline kicked in my body and I ran even faster and eventually reached the lake. One of them was nearly 10 feet away from me before I jumped in. I swam as fast as my body would let me, but one of them grabbed my leg and tried pulling me back into the world. I kicked it in the face and swam deeper and deeper until I finally reached my world. I swam out of the water and onto the shore coughing, trying to catch my breath. I stood up and looked up at the clear blue sky, happy of being back home. The old man was at the other side of the lake. His voice echoed through my ears as he spoke. He stared at me and laughed with a dry, raspy laugh. "You'll come back, John. When you're ready, you'll know where your family resides." "Fuck you, old piece of shit." I just ran to my car and drove off home. The sight of civilians relaxed me and brought me back to peace. Finally, I was home. Well, that's my story. I'm so happy I got that off my chest. Thank you all for listening. I wish I had told my family and my friends about the experience, but I was afraid they'd all laugh at me, calling me a madman. The only reason I told you this story is because I've been hearing the same gurgling noise, and I know it's them. Those black, distorted figures, waiting to drag me back to the forsaken place, the land of sorrow, known as Crow's Lake.